Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with the Grim Dawn class examination. Today we will be looking at the Vindicator. Now this particular overview is going to be assuming you either want to improv the class, you don't have any items for the class, or you're just looking for some inspiration for some builds of your own. Now, once again, I'm actually going to pop right into this because there isn't really necessarily there aren't necessarily broad playstyles of the Vindicator like a couple of the other classes. There's just kind of skills that you generally want to put together overall. So I'm going to tackle it from that perspective because in terms of actual coordination, obviously they share lightning damage, but not much else. So what do you actually have as options for good combinations? Well, first off, something that I actually want to talk about that not a whole lot of other people talk about with the Vindicator is pets with the Vindicator. Now, I don't really mind splashing in the Briarthorn, especially with Emboldening Presence, if you're a melee Vindicator. Now, keep in mind this is specifically for melee Vindicators. If you are a ranged Vindicator, if you want to splash in the Briarthorn, you only really need Ground Slam, because again, you're probably not going to be in range of your Briarthorn to utilize Emboldening Presence, but if you're melee, go Emboldening Presence, because it's boosting your retaliation damage, and if you slap in Arcane Empowerment with Inquisitor Seal, you are dealing some pretty decent amounts of retaliation damage through Arcane Empowerment. It's boosting your damage, it's boosting your Briarthorn's damage. It's just a really excellent time. It's just a wonderfully smart move. You splash in the Horn of Gandar for some confusion if you really want to, and you can absolutely do a large quantity of damage pretty safely, for the most part, with the Briarthorn. But again, if you're ranged, Ground Slam, don't necessarily need Inquisitor Seal, you can still use it on yourself or your Briarthorn as you need, but considering that your Briarthorn is more of a accent than an actual focus, I wouldn't really devote any items or even skills to the Briarthorn. I would just take the Briarthorn as backup. For melee, you're building him specifically to buff you with his Emboldening Presence. If you're ranged, you're using him as a tank. Again, you're not really... I mean, you can use the Primal Spirit for this. Again, you can... If anytime your Briarthorn dies, and if the skill itself is on cooldown, you pop out a Primal Spirit really quick. Sorry, I just punched my mic. You pop out a Primal Spirit really quick, and the Primal Spirit will distract the enemy until you can get your Briarthorn back online. So there is a use there for the Primal Spirit, but I wouldn't actually go into Primal Bond. It does actually work somewhat with Inquisitor, because there is a certain amount of physical damage that the Inquisitor does, but overall, I've found that Primal Bond isn't really that worth it overall. Again, you can go into this, especially if you're melee, because you can utilize Savagery and Primal Strike and absolutely slap down large quantities of enemies. If you decide to go with that, instead of the Horn of Gandar, you can use Primal Strike and chain stun your enemies that way, and be able to use the physical and bleeding buff from Primal Bond. So you can use this. It's just very hyper-focused in on melee, specifically two-handed, so you can do the chain stun, you can utilize the bleed, you might even be willing to plop in a Wendigo Totem, because Blood Pact is going to be able to benefit from that bleeding damage. That's totally up to you, but if you are going to go Primal Bond, I do suggest that you at least, if you're going to run this for the first time, use a two-handed weapon, specifically a melee weapon. And then, once you kind of get the hang of that, maybe you switch over to a ranged weapon if you feel like it, if you really, really want to. But it is tough to run Primal Bond with a ranged weapon, because you're not getting the benefit from the Briarthorn. You're not going to be able to help both your Briarthorn and yourself with your Inquisitor Seal. You will be able to take advantage of ranged expertise, of course, which is nice. But if you use two-handed, you can at the very least use Primal Strike. You can still use Savagery. You can utilize Brute Force if you really want to. Keep in mind also, whether you're ranged or whether you're melee, Wendigo Totem with Primal Bond, it can still be effective specifically with Blood Pact, because it will heal your Wendigo. It'll heal your Briarthorn, which increases his durability substantially and really makes him much more of a true tank. Also, if you are running melee, Mugdragon's Pact is a little bit more effective because it'll boost your Briarthorn. You can still use it without a Briarthorn, and you can still use it ranged. It's just not... You're mostly going to be building it then for Heart of the Wild for the increased health, regen, the duration reduction on your poison and bleeding damage, and the Oak Skin, which is absolutely amazing resistances, by the way. Again, this is a boost to retaliation damage, so just a shout out here to Arcane Empowerment, which does that fire retaliation. But what else would you theoretically want? How else can you approach this? Well, personally for me, if I'm not, whether or not I'm splashing Briarthorn, sometimes I'll run this even with the Briarthorn, is Stormcaller's Pact is extremely powerful, and I think a lot of people underestimate Stormcaller's Pact with the Vindicator. People are generally going to go for Aura of Censure, for example, is very common. I'll talk about that in a bit, but in Vindicator, a lot of people build this, but they don't really talk about the insane benefits you can get out of this. It's just kind of assumed, which is fair enough. But with this, you can absolutely not only go with Primal Strike. Again, I usually use two-handed melee for this. Savagery. Sometimes I'll build Brute Force, sometimes I won't. It depends on what items I have. If I'm running a Stormcaller's Pact Vindicator, I'm almost always taking Primal Strike. I'm almost always taking Savagery. These are just standard, really awesome. Whether or not I take Storm Totem or I take Storm Box depends, again, on my items. I don't usually take both of them, personally. I'll usually take one or the other, because Stormbox kind of emphasizes damage to one target. Even if you get Lightning Tether, you're still primarily looking to deal with that target, and then you're just using the tether on enemies in between. Whereas Storm Totem, you just throw it out there, it zaps people nearby. My personal preference between the two of them is Storm Totem. I just have a strange fondness for Storm Totems, but that's pure personal preference. You can go with Stormbox if that is to your taste. Absolutely. But beyond that, what if, say, you want to be ranged? Well, that's fantastic. You can utilize Storm Spread, you can utilize Chilling Rounds, and you can bust out ranged expertise, and you can absolutely slap fools. This is great. You can also utilize Rune of Hagrad for some freezing if you really wanted to. Now, again, at any point here, because of the elemental nature of the Inquisitor, Wind Devils are fairly decently useful. So this is one of the very few combinations, like the Arcanist Shaman combination. This is one of those few combinations where Wind Devil can really be nice. At least for their aura, if nothing else. So, personally, I'm not a huge fan of these, so I'll only build these if I have something that enhances these. Personally, but there's just so many different things you can do with just Stormcaller's Pact. I do like two-handed ranged, although I do personally prefer melee. Ranged is great as well. If I am going to go with ranged, for example, hold on, let me actually demonstrate this a little bit here, right? So, let's say you are running full Stormcaller's Pact, right? You want Savagery, right? Tenacity the Boar, Storm Touched, Lip Smacking Good, Primal Strike for that fantastic stun. Torrent, amazing. Storm Surge, absolutely slaps. Ranged Expertise, Chilling Rounds, Storm Spread. Now you've got a couple options. Pardon me. Now, what are your options? Well, you can run with Storm Totem, one of my favorites. You can run Rune of Hagrad, or you can run Stormbox of Elgaloth. Now, personally, Rune of Hagrad is probably the more broadly useful, because it'll actually freeze enemies, which is absolutely fantastic. Right? Now, how you actually want to distribute these is entirely up to you. Maybe you want to pull 4 points out of this, just so you can maximize Chill Surge, totally up to you. But that is probably strategically the most sound, because you're actually able to freeze enemies, which can be quite potent, but choose whichever one of them you want. Or maybe you don't want to focus on the auto attacks, maybe you pull out Savagery, you pull out all these, you go into Stormbox, you go into Rune of Hagrad, you go into Storm Totem, and you're just really spamming abilities to the enemy. That's fine too. Or maybe instead of Rune of Hagrad, you want Deadly Aim. Also very effective. Maybe you instead want Word of Renewal. You get up to Vigor, you go into Steel Resolve, which is, by the way, very nice, because Savagery does, I believe, a certain amount of internal trauma damage. Bleeding, nope, this does not. It's that's Brute Force I'm thinking of. Yeah, it's Brute Force. But you could actually, hold on 1 second, what you can also do as well, give me these points back really quick. Ooh, nope, we went too far back. You can actually run a nearly full auto-attacking build here, and think about it this way, right? drop this for a second. Whether you're this is ideally two-handed ranged, right? Brute Force, Feral Hunger, Upheaval, and then your last 12... I usually will put them into Storm Totem. You can put them into all kinds of different things. You could put them into Deadly Aim nice and cleanly. But at this point, you're basically just spamming auto attacks. Savagery is doing large quantities of damage. Brute Force is wiping the floor with people. And you've got your attack damage converted to health over here. You've got some freezing that you can do. You've got all of the electric damage here. You've got your self-heal. You've got your extra damage. You have your extra health regeneration. You have the absolute devastating Storm Touched. You've got, of course, the Stormcaller's Pact dealing extra damage, extra crit damage, which combos really well, by the way, with Deadly Aim, especially once you get that offensive ability, which increases your critical hit percentage. It's quite fantastic. You can run this. But what I usually do, as I've mentioned before, is I prefer the melee version, which pulls these out in favor of Primal Strike. Now, when you're going to run Primal Strike, at the very least, Max Torrent, you want that at the very least. You want those 5 targets. Storm Surge is excellent. Oops. Not strictly necessary, but if you are going to run this, you can pull these back here, get those 8 points, and get very nearly Max Storm Surge. I'll usually actually pull a couple of points out of Upheaval because I value Storm Surge a little bit more personally. That's just me. But absolutely fantastic. You can absolutely run this. Chain Stun, Auto Attack to your heart's content, Heal when needed. I mean, there's all kinds of really amazing things you can do with abilities. And again, another interesting idea is if you don't want to do auto attacks at all, you don't have to. You are completely free to absolutely devastate your enemies with the most fascinating combination of skills you've ever seen. And this is actually extremely useful. You still have to be equipped with a two-handed weapon of some kind for this. I prefer melee because it allows me to use Storm Totems on farther out enemies, but you can absolutely slap all kinds of stuff on your enemies, and it gets quite delightfully gruesome. Right? Actually, I think we might have been able to keep points in that. Some points, anyways. Yeah, good enough. Alright. Actually, if you're two-handed, you might even want to do Word of Arms, which at the very least makes this a little bit faster to trigger. But yeah, you can chain stun here, and then when they're stunned, you throw down some Storm Totems. You bust out a Storm Box. Maybe you want to go Rune of Hagrad. You don't have to. I often find that this is still extremely nice, since your abilities obviously can auto-attack, and since you're chain stunning with Primal Strike for the most part, Rune of Hagrad is not that useful overall. Maybe you want to instead put down Inquisitor Seal underneath yourself, just so that you have a little bit of damage absorption there. You know, just a good sign. Maybe you want to put a couple of extra points in here, just so we can get some points into Arcane Empowerment. Very nice as well. You have all these great options. Maybe you pull a couple points out of Steel Resolve, because you really don't need all that in there, right? Go into full Arcane Empowerment, and all you do is stun, totem, Storm Box, rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat. And the only enemies that'll actually ever even whistle wind past your ears will be anything that's immune to stun. Everything else, chain stun to death. And they're not going to be able to do anything about it. Again, unless they're immune to stun. But while there are a decent number of regular enemies, basically anyone that's immune to lightning, or, I'm sorry, resistant to lightning is going to be pretty resistant to stun. Bosses and heroes tend to not care. Nemesis tend to not care. But that's why you have Storm Box. You just Storm Box them and run. When the Storm Box fades, refresh, run. It takes a little while, but it works. So you absolutely have that option as well. Now, if you wanted to... Another interesting strategy you can run, which I find kind of funny, but it basically is employing the same idea here. It's just not as lightning focused, but conceptually Aura of Censure, Primal Strike, you get those stuns up again, you run the Storm Totem, It's not really a huge difference, because Stormcaller's Pact is directly boosting this damage, whereas instead Aura of Censure is doing fire damage over time and reduces elemental resistance. Technically, this is going to be really better against ethereals, but you already have bleed damage inherent with Primal Strike in the first place. So actually, this is one of those situations in which you don't necessarily need Aura of Censure's elemental resistance. It's not that big of a deal, because whether you're using Savagery or Primal Strike, you're doing elemental and bleeding damage, which means you've got a response to most enemies one way or the other. So, I mean, there's some very specific examples, specific heroes, specific bosses that are going to resist both of these, but they're very rare. So, it's not overall going to be that much of a problem, but you do have that response. So, whether you choose Stormcaller's Pact or you choose Aura of Censure is entirely your decision. The only time I prefer Aura of Censure over Stormcaller's Pact personally is, again, if I'm playing with allies, if I'm playing with family or friends. If I'm playing with family or friends, the elemental resistance drop of Aura of Censure is going to do more for the group than Stormcaller's Pact is. Stormcaller's Pact is purely boosting yourself, which is completely fine in a single-player game. But if you're playing in a party, Aura of Censure will roughly achieve the same idea. You won't be able to do as much lightning or cold damage, but you're doing more damage through a drop in resistances, and you're doing fire damage over time to make up for that. So you're not doing... Think of it this way. Aura of Censure does the same damage as the Stormcaller's Pact does, but over a longer period of time. Just as effective. Over 5 seconds, Stormcaller's Pact will do more burst. Aura of Censure is more of a wear down. Let me put it that way. I think that's a better way of describing it. Stormcaller's Pact, burst. Boom, boom, boom. Aura of Censure is just a constant sizzle over time. That helps your allies a lot as well. Now, if Aura of Censure isn't something that your allies are interested in having as a support, maybe they want Aura of Conviction. This is just fine. If you are going to use Aura of Conviction and you're working with allies, though, I do strongly recommend the auto-attack version, be it ranged or melee, because you'll be able to get more out of Brute Force, which does internal trauma damage, which does bleeding damage, whereas Primal Strike is not doing internal trauma damage, and, well, it is doing the bleeding damage, it is doing the physical damage. Brute Force is actually taking advantage of that. So if you are going to be using Aura of Conviction, I do recommend use two-handed weapons. Use the auto-attack build. Again, whether it's melee or ranged, entirely up to you. Brute Force, Savagery, Primal Strike if you're melee, these if you're not. It works out extremely well. I don't normally use Word of Pain with this. Again, if there are allies present, not a bad investment. I still don't often utilize this, even in that situation, though, personally. Because Aura of Conviction or Aura of Censure are going to do more for your team anyways. And Horn of Gandar is, of course, delightful with Aura of Conviction. But you can... That's the interesting thing about the Vindicator. There's a lot of things that really, as you can see, there's no real wrong way to build this. I don't often go into Flames of Ignifer, and I don't often go into Rune of Callistor, because there are better options. But beyond that, I also don't often go into Grasping Vines. This can be really nice if you're splashing in the pet and you want to go Primal Bond or what have you. It's fine then. But that's about the only time I'll build this. I almost never go into Devouring Swarm. I just don't need Vitality Resistance drop a lot of the time. You know, the bleeding I can take advantage of if I'm going Primal Bond, because, hey, look, we've got bleeding here, hey, look, we've got more bleeding here, hey, look, we've got bleeding here. Yes, that's fine. This also heals you. Devouring Swarm does so little damage that even with the resistance drops, it's often not worth it. At least not for the Vindicator. With other class combinations, it's a little different story. For example, this is actually decently useful with the Occultist, but with the Vindicator, it's not something you want. You just don't need this very often. So the only time I'll really even think of Grasping Vines is if I'm going with an actual pet build. And this is going to apply to either melee or ranged characters, so that doesn't really make a huge difference there. But I do really like this combination. It's fairly cooperative. It no matter what situation you find yourself in, you can find a way to make this combination work. It does not matter what you're up against. It doesn't matter who you're working with. This will work out. So if you want something that's like the absolute answer to everything, sort of, like I said, there are very specific heroes and bosses that are resistant to a combination of your elemental and bleeding damage, but that's not a whole lot of them. Most enemies are going to be resistant to either your elemental damage in some capacity or your bleeding. So, you know, if allies decide, if you're one of those people who plays online and just sees who drops in, this is the class for you. This is gonna set you up in such a way that you can do just as fine on your own, but you can really boost allies if you need. So this is very interesting for that reason. But that's all I'm really going to say about the Vindicator. Thank you all very much for joining me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me. Have a great 24 hours.